Over the last decade, I've studied excellence and I've worked with some of the world's best performers in the process. And what makes a professional athlete or an Olympian great, it's not waking up at 5 a.m. to cold plunge and gaze at the sun. But what they all have in common is a relentless focus on the fundamentals of their craft, executing those fundamentals with ruthless consistency for years, adopting the right mindsets, and surrounding themselves with the right people.
Hi, folks. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today with our guest, Brad Stulberg. Brad is a leading expert on how to thrive amid change and disorder and disruption. He's the author of two best-selling books. First, The Practice of Groundedness, which I have here, which the subtitle is A Transformative Path to Success That Feeds, Not Crushes Your Soul. And second, a more recent book, which is also excellent, which is called Master of Change. And the subtitle is How to Excel When Everything is Changing, Including You. In many ways, this is a practical guide on how to excel in a world of disruption. And we're seeing this on every side. So also, Brad is a coach. He works with high performers, including top executives, entrepreneurs, physicians, athletes, and the like. And it's lovely to have you here, Brad. I'm really delighted to see you today.
It's an honor to be here, William.
We're going to talk a lot about how to thrive amid change and disorder and uncertainty. And I wanted to start by asking you about your own experience of change in the last decade. Basically, I know that you've had a number of experiences that led you to see that change and disorder are, as you write, not the exceptions, they're the rules. What happened in the last few years before this book came out that in a way prepared you for this insight that really all of us are going to have to learn to adapt to change because it's not a glitch in the system. It's here to stay.
Yeah. So a multitude of factors, I think, converged that led me to this question of change in general, or at least this topic of change to explore. In my personal life, I left a very secure job where I was on staff as a performance coach at one of the largest healthcare systems in the world to develop my own private practice in coaching and spend more time writing. That coincided with a move across the country from the San Francisco Bay Area to Asheville, North Carolina. So from a major population center to a much smaller mountain town. I became a father for the first time and then again for the second time. I had a book become an international bestseller. And I also had some writing projects that I was very hopeful for completely fail. And then I experienced an injury that took me out of endurance sports, particularly running and triathlon, that had been a very large part of my identity and how I saw myself. And a condition in my calf really led to a very early premature retirement from all competitive endurance sports. And then, of course, there were the societal changes, some of which are rather unique to being an American. There's the geopolitical shift, the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And then there's the Corona-19 virus and pandemic. So I was living through all of these personal changes, then these societal changes. And I shared my experience with colleagues, friends, neighbors, other folks in the community. And the first thing I got was a whole lot of empathy. That it wasn't just me, as so many people feel like the pace of change has really accelerated both in personal and professional and societally. I'm sure we'll get into it. I have some hypotheses as for why people feel that way. But ultimately, I am someone that doesn't really like change. I thrive when things are stable. And one of the first things that I learned in my research is that it's not just me. All living organisms thrive when we have stability. The second thing that I learned in my research is that the average adult goes through more than 35 major life changes. So there's a paradox there that we tend to feel our best when there's stability, yet none of us really have very much lasting stability in our life at all. And I felt very much stuck between extremes of trying to deny and resist change and cling to stability, which just seemed to lead to restlessness and angst, versus completely throwing one's hands up and saying, I'm just going to go with the flow and completely surrender, which isn't really in my nature and is not in the nature of so many people. And that really led me into this exploration of why we conceive of change the way that we do, how we got here, and might there be better tools and better frameworks and mental models for thinking about navigating change.
Early in 2021, you started grappling with this question when you were listening to people talking about COVID and saying, well, let's hope that at some point we can get back to normal. And you started thinking about the implications of that change, and it led you to think about different models for navigating change, one of which was homeostasis, and one of which was a term that you think is a better model for understanding change, which is allostasis. Can you talk us through that? Because it's kind of an important intellectual framework for understanding that we actually have to think about change differently.
Yeah, that's right. And before I do that, I forgot another just huge significant change that I underwent in the last decade. And that is throughout my childhood and early adulthood and even into middle adulthood, I had always like very sound mental health. And around the age of 30, I suffered a very severe clinical depression that really came out of nowhere and made me quite sick for the better part of a year. So that was another just huge disruption that I could have never imagined. And that's within that same chapter preceding this book of all this change. So it really was the good, the bad, the ugly, but everything just felt like it was constantly in flux and constantly shifting. So wanted to throw that in because I think that's important. So homeostasis versus allostasis. Homeostasis, my sense is that many, if not all listeners of the podcast will have heard of this term. And it traces itself all the way back to the early 1600s. So long before we had any sort of quote unquote science, and really just to the beginnings of empiricism, meaning people in the community would observe something and then they'd observe it again and then they'd develop a theory around it, right? This is what's just starting to happen at this time period. And homeostasis is a term that describes what people saw when those in the late 1600s got ill. So most people would have a body temperature of around 98.6, and then you get sick and you spike a fever. So your body temperature raises as an immune system marshals a response. And this is long before we had antibiotics or antivirals. So you got sick, you had a fever. And what would happen back then is some people would die and their body temperature never returned to normal. And other people, over time, their body temperature would return to normal. They'd fight off the infection and they'd be healthy. So homeostasis describes change as a pattern of order or stability, then disorder or instability, in this case, a fever. And then it says that a healthy system gets back to order as quickly as it can. So it's order, disorder, back to order. And what started out truly to describe a fever, over the last 500 years, talk about scope creep, it became the prevailing mental model and framework for all change. So not just for human biology, but for human psychology, not just on the individual level, but on the organizational level. And now you can spend time on the internet and say, how do I change my financial habits? How do I change my health habits? How do I lose weight? And the first page of all those SEO hits is going to be something about fighting against homeostasis or fighting against the natural urge to stay the same or go back to order. So that had been the prevailing model of how people think about change. And baked into that model is that change is inherently bad, right? Because we want to move from disorder back to where we were. And that the goal then is to resist change to avoid it, or when we're faced with change, to immediately get back to stability. Now, about 20 years ago, a cohort of cutting-edge interdisciplinary scientists, largely based out of the University of Pennsylvania, they had a little bit of an epiphany, which is essentially homeostasis. Well, it describes what happens when you have a fever. It's actually not a very good fit model for thinking about most other changes that we undergo. And they stepped back and they did this big analysis of both at the individual level, but then also at the organizational level and even at the species level, how those that endure and weather challenges, what's their path? What's the model that they follow? And what they found is they found this allostatic response, and they coined this term allostasis, which essentially says that when faced with change, a healthy living system moves from order to disorder to reorder. So it's true that we crave stability, but that stability is always somewhere new. We don't go back to where we were. And I think the etymology of these words really elegantly sums up the story. So homeostasis comes from the Latin root homo, which means same, and then stasis, which means standing. So it argues that we achieve stability by staying the same, right? That's the goal. stay the same, achieve stability. Allostasis comes from the Latin root allo, which means change or variable, and then stasis, which again means standing. So allostasis says that we achieve stability through change. And it has this elegant double meaning, which is that one, it's possible to be stable through change. And two, the way to be stable through change, is by changing, at least to some extent. And those two different models really become these mindsets that totally transform how you approach uncertainty, change, and instability, right? Because in one model, it's inherently a threat, and the goal is to get back to where you were. And in the other model, it is just the first rule of thermodynamics, that things move towards chaos and entropy, and that we're always existing in systems that are changing. And the goal isn't to be stable by resisting change. That's a fool's errand. The goal is to be stable through the process of change, through those cycles of order, disorder, reorder.
I think curiously, and you tap into this in your book, this is something that spiritual traditions understood in a way that maybe science often didn't. So right, you mentioned Richard Rohr, the Christian theologian, who talked about going from order to disorder to reorder. In the same way, actually, I have a chapter in my book, Richer, Wiser, Happier, titled Everything Changes, that begins with a famous quote from Shunryu Suzuki, the author of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, who said that everything changes is the basic truth for each existence. No one can deny this truth, and all the teaching of Buddhism is condensed within it. And one of the things that he then went on to say later in that book, which is a terrific book, is he said, if we cannot accept this teaching that everything changes, we cannot be in composure. And I was very struck when I was working on my book that this whole theme of change runs massively through investing. So you have someone like Howard Marks saying, well, okay, so if everything is in constant flux, including the economy and markets and industries and companies and our own lives, then actually somehow I have to accommodate myself to the reality that things are changing. I can't just be in denial. And so that's actually really helped him to become a multi-billionaire. And likewise, Bill Miller, who was the greatest mutual fund manager of his generation, said to me at one point, 20-something years ago, the world changes. This is the biggest problem in markets. And so I think what's curious is that this whole theme of change, which seems kind of abstract, has actually run through spirituality for thousands of years and has also run through investing in business, because this is the incredibly shaky quicksand on which our lives and businesses and investments are constructed. And so my sense is just we have to accommodate ourselves to this reality, whether we're trying to construct, as Howard Marks would say, an anti-fragile life or an anti-fragile portfolio. Sorry for that long soliloquy, but does that raise any thoughts from you, Brad?
Oh, it does. So the first is I unsurprisingly tend to agree with you. I think that in between disorder and reorder, there are often many opportunities. So if you're an investor, that could be an opportunity to beat the market. That could be an opportunity to be a little bit ahead of what's already priced in on the coming reorder. If you're an athlete that is undergoing an injury, that could be an opportunity to reshape your game or to make adjustments to come back a different player. If you are in a relationship, whether it's a business partnership or romantic partnership, a period of disorder can be a time for growth in the relationship if you can come back together, having learned from the challenge. And in our personal lives, when we're in the midst of disorder, even though it can feel extremely uncomfortable and at times even mortifying and painful, the research shows that when we get to the other side of these challenges, we tend to derive some meaning and some growth from them. So I think that it's just whether we like it or not, everything changes, as you said. Like impermanence is just a basic rule of every ancient wisdom tradition, and it is the first rule of physics. So whether you look at it from a scientific angle or a spiritual angle, you come to the same place. And impermanence works both ways. Sometimes it's a cause of real challenge and distress, and sometimes it's a cause of wonderful things. It's just the air that we breathe. The other thing that I would say that I think is really interesting, and this is a theme that is in my first book, The Practice of Groundedness. So I come from a family of investors. I don't know if you know that about me. I kind of broke the molds and went off and became an author and a coach. So my grandfather was an investor. My father's an investor. My cousin took over the practice and has been trying to get me to, I guess he stopped about 10 years ago trying to get me to work with him. So I grew up around finance, and the concept of regression to the mean has always stuck with me, in how in an allostatic system, you are going through these cycles of order, disorder, reorder. And sometimes the entire curve shifts in ways that are very hard to predict. They're impossible to predict. But generally, there's some signal amidst all the variance as a system progresses and moves towards change. And I think that that's important to keep in mind. So at the same time that everything's always changing, there's some kind of base stability. And then there's these generational events that perhaps shift the entire curve. And I think navigating life well and navigating markets well probably depends on holding these competing ideas at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing you're very good at in your books, and that we'll come to later, is you have this ability to hold contradictory or conflicting ideas in some sort of dynamic tension, so that it's often yes and rather than either or. So we'll get to that later. But yeah, I guess this is one of the great themes of that chapter, Everything Changes, where I was writing about Howard Marks, is that in some ways you're in real trouble because the future is unknowable and everything is changing. And yet we have to make decisions about the future, both as investors and parents, and where we're living or what job to take or anything like that. And on the other hand, as Howard would point out, you can look at the cycles of the past and you can see that there are certain things that repeat, like patterns of human greed or overexcitement and irrational exuberance. And so there are things that repeat and there are things that are totally new. And this is one of the things that makes investing so unbelievably difficult and complex, because it's hard to tell, like, is this really a new paradigm or is it just the same old thing? So anyway, I wanted to ask you really in some depth about the various tools that we can use to navigate change, because you're so practical about analyzing how we can do this and giving us practical methods for doing this. But first, I wanted really to get you to define the idea, the concept that's really at the heart of Master of Change, which is this term rugged flexibility. Can you define what you mean about it and explain why we need to be both rugged and flexible, why we need these two opposing capabilities so that we can navigate this very uncertain, changing world in a deft and robust way?
So to be rugged is to be determined, durable, very robust. Nassim Taleb would say anti-fragile. And to be flexible is to be soft and supple and to bend easily without breaking. And on its face, these are two opposite terms, right? But in my reporting and research for this book, what I found is that those individuals that are able to withstand change and grow from change, they're not rugged or flexible, they're rugged and flexible. They would score very high on both of these traits. And then you zoom out and you look at the empirical change for which is by far of the greatest magnitude. And that's how you and I got here today, William. It's evolution, the survival of the fittest and selection of species. Essentially, what happens on a scale of the planet is you have cycles of order where there's stability and then disorder. So there's climate change, there's a meteor, something happens to an apex predator, and the whole ecosystem shifts into disorder. And then there's reorder, right? It comes out different. And you look at species that have survived over time for the longest durations, and what evolutionary biologists find is that those species are rugged and flexible. Those are my terms. And evolutionary biologists would say they're highly complex. But what this means is that there are parts of the species that are so central and core to what they are that if those parts changed, the species would no longer be recognizable. It would be a new species. But outside of those central features and those core parts, what I call the basis of ruggedness, if you're not extremely flexible on everything else, then you're also going to get selected out. So if you have no ruggedness and it's all flexibility, then there's really no center of gravity. There's no you, there's no strength. But if you're so rugged across the board that you can't be adaptable and you can't be flexible on anything else, then when there's a big change or when something shifts, you're going to get selected out. Or at an individual level, you're going to suffer from anxiety and neuroticism. So I'm not interested in studying evolution at the planetary scale, but I think that our personal evolution and our organizational evolution, or the evolution of a family, it follows that same framework, right? Of this order, disorder, reorder, or stability, instability, new stability. And the way to work through those cycles is to know what's core and what makes you who you really are as a person, or if it's as an investor, your principles, your philosophy of the market, and not to budge on those things, right? Those are your sources of ruggedness. Those are the hills to die on. And then to be willing to be flexible and to adapt and to change on everything else. So really getting really clear on what are your core values, what are your guiding principles, and then what is merely habit that you can be willing to change on. And this holds true at the level of how you would navigate change in a certain domain of life. So as an athlete that gets injured, is somebody whose kids are moving out of the house, is someone that's approaching retirement. But it also holds true as you think about your life as a whole and just how you age and how you grow over time, this notion of rugged flexibility. And it really solved my personal problem of needing a new way to think about change. As I mentioned at the start of the book, and as I mentioned in the start of this conversation, I personally struggle with change, but I'm also a realist. I pride myself on seeing things sometimes too clearly. And I saw that like everything changes, but I didn't like the idea of not having a center of gravity. And rugged flexibility for me is a construct that solves that because it gives you permission to be rugged and to define yourself by something and to have a ground that you stand on, while at the same time asking yourself to practice massive flexibility around those core features.
I want to talk in some depth with you about various practical tools and practices and strategies to develop rugged flexibility in our daily life, because this is going to help our listeners a great deal as investors, as family people, as people constructing a career in our approach to our health, everything really. And so I want to go through in some detail various tools that you've written about, not only in this latest book, but also actually in your previous book and on your podcast. You've talked about it, and I'll include a lot of these sources and resources in the show notes. You mentioned core values a minute ago. Obviously, that's really an important aspect of this, is figuring out what you really stand for in the beginning so that that's going to guide you. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of core values as a kind of North Star to guide you through these challenges and changes and disruptions, and also then give us a sense of what actually is a smart process for establishing or clarifying what our values might be?
Core values are your guiding principles or the qualities to which you aspire. So these are the things that are most important to you. A few examples are health, creativity, compassion, strength, kindness, wisdom, intellect, rigor, integrity, spirituality, family, reason, so on and so forth. And what a whole lot of psychology research shows is that when you have about anywhere from 2 to 5 core values, and when you're acutely aware of what those are and also how to practice them, you tend to feel less stress when you are under threat or when there's challenges or changes. And you also tend to navigate change better because you have essentially a compass. You have your core values to help guide you. So that's the value of knowing your core values, is that when you're faced with change and when it feels like everything around you is in flux and shifting and the ground that you're standing on is swept out from under you, if you know your core values, you can ask yourself, what would the creative thing to do be here? What would someone who values integrity do? What would someone who values wisdom do in this situation? And then those core values become a rudder to help guide you through the unknown. In terms of a process for deducing one's core values, this lies at the heart of something called acceptance and commitment therapy, which was really developed first to help individuals through depression. But since then, there's been hundreds, even now thousands of studies showing that it's a good model for human flourishing and well-being beyond the absence of illness. And within acceptance and commitment therapy, the basis is very simple, which is see clearly and accept what's happening, and then commit to acting in alignment with your core values. Now, simple doesn't mean easy, and the practice of this is quite challenging. So the first step is to determine one's core values. In the book, I list 100 example core values just to get folks started with brainstorming. But the method that I find works best is to group like terms. So go through a list and maybe you have 20 terms. Again, you want to get down to 3 to 5, even 2 to 5. And then you take those 20 terms and you start to put them in groups based on similarities. And what most people find is you've got somewhere between 2 to 6 groups that are pointing at a somewhat condensed theme. And then you want to find the right word that represents that theme, and then you want to define it in real concrete terms. Because core values, they shouldn't just be something that is on a poster at your office, or if it's on a little sticky note on your mirror. They should have some teeth. You should be able to practice them. And that way, they become a basis for stability in your day-to-day life all the time. And particularly when things are changing, you can look back to your core values to help guide you into the unknown. I think a story of this, a story that really brings this to life is that of the tennis star Roger Federer, who's known obviously for his greatness in tennis, really for his greatness in sport, but also for his longevity. So Federer played well into his late 30s, even early 40s, in a sport where prior to him, most people would peak and retire before they hit 32. And Roger Federer, he came before LeBron James, before Tom Brady, before Serena Williams. He was really the first power sport athlete to redefine aging and longevity in sport. What a lot of people don't know about Roger Federer is that between the ages of 33 and 36, he didn't win a single tournament, not a single tournament. So you look back at articles written about Federer during that time period, and everyone in the tennis community, all the critics, they said that the change that comes for every tennis player aging finally caught up to Roger. And it was time to retire. And just the fact that he made it to 33 being world-class, right? Like 33, you're a dinosaur in that sport. So what did Federer do? For the first year and a half of his slump, he essentially followed a homeostasis model to change. He tried to get back to where he was. So he just kept beating his head against the wall and said, I'm the greatest player of all time. I still want to keep playing tennis. I think I can. What happened? He repeatedly got injured and underperformed. And then about a year and a half into this journey of underperformance and injury, he had this epiphany that essentially said he's not the same player he was. He has aged. And Federer steps back and does something that is so hard for an athlete to do. And he separates what his core values are, which for him in this context, competition, mastery, and a love of the game of tennis, from what's habit. And for him, what habit was a Wilson racket, playing at the baseline, a two-handed backhand, training 7 days a week. So Federer says, I want to hold on to my core values. Those are my sources of ruggedness. I want to keep playing tennis. I want to keep competing, and I want to keep moving down the path of mastery. But in order to do that, he realized he has to be flexible on everything else. So he completely reinvents his game. He learns a one-handed backhand to take speed off the ball. He starts playing at the net more, which has the effect of shortening points, so he doesn't have to run back and forth on the baseline against the younger kids. He completely overhauls his training schedule to allow more time for rest and recovery. And then he even changes his racket, right? So he had used the same racket since he's 15, made him the greatest tennis player ever at the time. And he adopts a new racket that has brand new technology that all the younger kids are using. And the result of this is at age 37, he has the best winning percentage of his career. He wins 2 major championships. He reclaims a top 3 ranking in the world. And then he continues to play well until he hits 40. So to me, that's this beautiful example of knowing your core values, your sources of ruggedness, the hills you're going to die on, using them to help determine your next moves during change, but then being very flexible on everything else. And when I was writing the book, I looked at tape of Federer playing when he was 26 and then again when he was 38. And on the one hand, he's the same Roger Federer. And on the other hand, he's completely different. And I think that that's what rugged flexibility is all about. Over time, you are the same William as you were 20 years ago, but you're also very different. And that gets to kind of the intellectual question at the heart of the book in those wisdom traditions is, what does it mean to have a sense of self when our very senses of selves are always changing? And I think it can make a rational Western brain explode, but the answer is both and. I'm both the same and I'm different. And Federer is someone that used those core values, that source of ruggedness, to navigate the unknown and to ultimately lead himself to a reorder that worked in service of his core values.
One of the practices or tricks that you talk about in the conclusion of The Master of Change is actually developing a fluid sense of self. It's clearly related to what you were just talking about with Federer Can you expand a little bit on that? And I know that it had a lot also to do with what happened to you when you had an injury and had to stop playing a sport that had obviously been a huge part of your identity. Can you give us a sense of why having a fluid sense of self, A, what it is, and B, why it would actually be helpful in enabling us to adapt to change?
A fluid sense of self essentially asks you to view your identity not as something that is completely static, but not as something that is completely amorphous either. Rather, to create an identity around your values and define those values fairly at a fairly broad level, and then be willing to shift within that structure. So that's very conceptual. For example, I, for a long time, had defined myself as a runner. That was a central part of my identity. Then I had this injury and I could no longer run. And I had orthopedic surgery. I mean, I went to Wyoming for this special treatment. After the normal treatment failed, I gave it my all and it didn't work. What I've learned is that my value isn't actually running. What I liked about running was having objective goals that I could chase in community. And I also liked using my body and challenging myself. But that's not running. That's mastery, that's community, and that's being an athlete. And if I could define my identity as someone that values mastery and athleticism and community, then losing running is not a loss of identity. It's a shift in how I express that part of my identity, but it doesn't feel like a loss of who I am. So when I see people and I hear people identify very closely with a specific activity, I urge them to think about, is it really the activity that is core to who you are, or is it something that is maybe a layer or two deeper? This very much relates to a framework in the book that was first developed by the humanist philosopher Erich Fromm, having versus being. And having is when you define yourself by what you have. So I have this skill set, I have this income, I have this house, I have this child, I have this relationship. And what Fromm points out is that, well, everything that you have is going to change. And at some point, it will probably be taken away. So if you define yourself by what you have, it's a very precarious way to construct an identity. Whereas if you define yourself by who you are, or what he called your being orientation, what I call your core values, no one can take those away from you. And a common question that I get listeners might have is, well, what if your core values change? And that's totally normal. But even then, it's your old core values that lead you to your new ones. And your sense of self and your sense of identity, it becomes more fluid. It almost becomes like this evolving process over time versus this static thing that you're always trying to protect or hold on to. Another framework in the book that so many professionals in particular have found really helpful around identity is this notion of diversifying your sense of self. So in investing, my limited understanding is that it's a pretty foundational rule is that barring very interesting circumstances, you generally want to diversify your portfolio to at least some degree. And the reason for that is if all your assets are in one class and something unforeseen happens to that asset class, you're SOL, you're in for it, you're in big trouble. Yet with our identities, so often we throw our entire sense of self into one asset class. And that can be the investor, the parent, the athlete, the leader of a company. And then if there's a change in that area of our life, especially if it's a negative one, it can feel like an attack on our entire sense of self. And if that's the only way that we define ourselves, then we're in for trouble, right? So much like we diversify our investment holdings, I argue in the book, it's actually good to diversify your sense of identity a little bit. To have multiple sources of meaning in one's life so that if you take a hit in one area of your identity, you can lean on the others for strength.
Yeah, this is such an important idea. And I mean, to give you a couple of our listeners, a couple of very real world examples, in the epilogue of my book, I write about this great investor, Jason Karp, who had been this unbelievably successful hedge fund guy. He'd started out working for Steve Cohen and had just like ridiculously good results and then ended up running his own hedge fund that had the fastest ever startup of any hedge fund. And then things started to go badly. And I remember interviewing him at the time, and he said to me, I didn't really know what to do when this started to go wrong because I'd never failed at anything. And his whole identity suddenly was in turmoil. And what's kind of amazing about Jason, who I've interviewed on the podcast, is he managed to reorient his whole life and reinvent himself in a kind of spectacular way. But I've seen that kind of disintegration also actually in my own life. I mean, I was editing the European, Middle Eastern, and African editions of Time magazine, and then got laid off in the middle of the financial crisis. And suddenly you're like, wait a second, I've been working 70, 80 hours a week at this thing I'm really good at, and now it's gone. And instead of getting to interview presidents and prime ministers, you're like, well, actually, so what am I now? And so having actually to be like, well, I'm a father and a husband and a writer and all these, I mean, it's really hard, that kind of dissolution of the ground on which you stand. So I think this idea of actually, A, having, as you put it, a fluid sense of self, but B, diversifying where you're going to get your meaning from is really important.
Buy low, sell high. It's easy to say, hard to do. For example, high interest rates are crushing the real estate market right now. Demand is dropping and prices are falling for many of the best assets. It's no wonder the Fundrise flagship fund plans to go on a buying spree, expanding its billion-dollar real estate portfolio over the next few months. You can add the Fundrise flagship fund to your portfolio in just minutes with as little as $10 by visiting fundrise.com/WSB. That's fundrise.com/WSB. Carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses of the Fundrise flagship fund before investing. This and other information can be found in the fund's prospectus at fundrise.com/flagship. This is a paid advertisement.
A metaphor that I like to use is to think of identity like a house. So if you have a house and it only has one room in it, and that one room catches fire or floods, you're screwed. It's going to be very discombobulating. You're going to have to move out of the house altogether. Whereas if you have a house and it has multiple rooms in it, and one room catches fire or floods, you can go into the other rooms to seek refuge while you figure out the fire or flood. And if we think about our identities the same way, we can have multiple rooms in our identity house. There can be the investor room, the spouse room, the parent room, the community member room, the athlete room, the book lover room, the travel room. Infinite options. It's just so important that we have more than one room, because at some point or another, all the rooms are going to experience turmoil. But odds are they're not all going to experience turmoil at the same time. So then you get to seek refuge in these other places within your identity house. And a couple of things to be really explicit about. I don't argue for balance. I'm not saying that the room should be the same size. I'm not saying that you should spend the same amount of time in every room. I actually think that it's very good to prioritize and to say, these are the rooms that for this season of life, I want to be all in on and spend a disproportionate share in those rooms. I just don't think that you should let any rooms that are core to who you are get moldy, because you never know when you're going to need them. The second thing that I would say about this metaphor is that, and I alluded to this, when I've interviewed people that are towards the end of their careers or that have retired and that have done really well and also have been highly fulfilled and satisfied with not only their career, but their life, and they've done it the right way. So they're not athletes that have doped. They haven't engaged in fraud. Like, they've really had good integrity on their path to success. What I find is that if you zoom in at any one juncture of their life, they look very unbalanced. But if you zoom out and look across their whole life, they look quite balanced. So they have different seasons for different emphases in their life. And what they're good at is they just never let the important rooms get moldy. So maybe there's a season where you're going all in on your career, but that marriage room is still really important. You can't let it get moldy. Doesn't mean that you have to emphasize it all the time, but you've got to figure out what's the minimum effective dose to maintain that room so that when the season of my life shifts, it's still there for me. I haven't let it go to. So I just can't emphasize enough how important it is to define the rooms in your identity house, to be really clear about what ones you're emphasizing and why, and just to make sure that you never completely ignore any other important ones.
I think this is such an important idea, because I look at so many of the great investors who've ended up divorced or with kids who don't talk to them. And I don't know, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's in a very high-powered, very intense job, and he's just let his health just fall apart because he doesn't want to neglect his kids, he doesn't want to neglect his spouse, and he's got unbelievable responsibility and deadlines at work. So he's just wrecked his body. And so yeah, this idea really resonates for me pretty deeply. I wanted to move us to another really important tool or practice, or in this case, a mindset, which you describe as a crucial life skill, which is the mindset of tragic optimism. Can you talk about this idea that originally comes from Viktor Frankl in this famous essay of his, The Case for Tragic Optimism? Because I think it's very distinctive also to your way of viewing life and the universe.
I'm so glad you asked. Frankl is most known for his book, Man's Search for Meaning, which he wrote, most of it he composed in his mind while he was in a concentration camp during the Holocaust. And then he survives the Holocaust. So many of his family members and friends are murdered by the Nazis. And he comes out and he publishes this work called Man's Search for Meaning. The first half of which is his memoir, I'd say, or close to memoir. And then the second half, he really develops what becomes existential psychotherapy. So it's this groundbreaking work, and any psychology major in university has read this book. But then he puts out this much lesser known essay later on called The Case for Tragic Optimism. And in it, Frankl argues that to be a human is to live a very tragic life. And he says that there's no way around this. It's inevitable. Even the greatest human life has tragedy. And he defines these three tragedies that everyone faces. The first is physical pain, because we're made of flesh and bone. Nobody gets out of life without experiencing physical pain. The second is heartbreak and disappointment. And that is because we have these big prefrontal cortices in our brains that allow us to make all these wonderful plans. And sometimes the plans don't work out. We're frustrated. And then the third tragedy is that, as far as we know, we're the only species that's keenly aware of our own mortality, so that we are going to die and everyone we love is going to die. And Frankl says that there's no reason to bury our head in the sand or to deny these. We have to accept that these are the tragedies inherent to being a human being. And yet, the work of a mature adult is to understand these tragedies and to maintain optimism and hope, not in spite of those tragedies, but almost because of them. Because we know that life is going to be full of tragedy, we have a responsibility to ourselves to maintain optimism and hope and to find joy too. And it doesn't have to be this or that. It doesn't have to be happy or sad, tragedy or optimism. It can be tragic optimism. We can accept the suffering in ourselves and in the world, while at the same time maintaining hope for ourselves and hope for the world. And I just think that though Frankl first wrote about this in the 1970s, it could not be more prescient and more timely now. I see it all the time. You log on to any part of the internet, and it's not long before you have these two extremes. One extreme I'm going to call the toxic positivity or the Pollyanna extreme, which is everything's great, don't bother me, I figured it out. I don't want to hear about your problems. Life is good. Why are you possibly complaining? There's never been a better time to be a human. And the other extreme is what I'm going to call the nihilism or despair extreme, which says that everything is broken, society's unraveling, all these systems and structures are so backwards that what can me, little individual, do? And then you just fall into despair or nihilism. On its face, these are polar opposites, but when you think about it, they actually have one thing in common, which is, in a way, they're kind of easy to adopt as mindsets because they absolve you of needing to do anything. So if everything is great always and you don't want to hear about any of the world's problems, well, then there's nothing to work on. There's nothing to make better. If everything is so terrible and so broken and so structurally broken that anything you do is pointless, well, then why would you act? So both toxic positivity and nihilism or despair, they absolve you of any responsibility to take action. And what Frankl would say, and what I argue, is that it is our job, and they're very seductive, these extremes, but it is our job not to fall into one of those extremes and to hold our ground in the middle and really embrace tragic optimism, to realize that there is a lot that's broken about the world, and there is a lot that needs improvement, and there is a lot that feels so overwhelming. And if we can maintain hope, we do have some agency to make our lives better and to make the world better. And so often you see extremes, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. It's all personal responsibility versus everything structural, and all that matters is what zip code you're born into. And any reasonable person will tell you it's both of those things matter. Both accountability and personal responsibility and individual behavior is very important. And what zip code you're born into is very important. And I just think that there's such a lack of nuance and extreme in especially on the internet, but really it's pervaded so much of the discourse in the Western world where it feels like you have to choose into these extremes when reality is messy and somewhere in the middle. And I think tragic optimism is just such a wonderful concept for embracing that messiness and for being a realist without falling into despair.
There's a beautiful line that you quote in the Master of Change that's from an interview that Bruce Springsteen did when he was 71 with The Atlantic, where he talked about the heart of wisdom amounting to learning, quote, to accept the world on its terms without giving up the belief that you can change the world. That's a successful adulthood, the maturation of your thought process and very soul to the point where you understand the limits of life without giving up on its possibilities. It's a wonderful insight. And I remember actually years ago when I was living in London going to see Springsteen in a concert at Wembley Stadium, and he came on so many times. I mean, for so many encores, I think it must have lasted the best part of 4 hours. And the highlight for me was, I guess it was the Wrecking Ball tour. And there was this moment where you see this aging guy with this broken body and this raspy voice basically singing, give me your best shot, and you just had this sort of defiant sense of this guy who accepted the fact that he had a lousy childhood, that his body was breaking down, that his voice was breaking down, that he was in pain. But there was something kind of triumphant and exultant about the fact that he just kept coming back amid the pain. So I think he kind of embodies that spirit, actually, of tragic optimism.
Oh, 100%. Another way to think about it in simple terms is like, you can't fix a broken world if you become a broken person. And to resign yourself to a broken world, in my opinion, is just, one, it's not very helpful, and two, it doesn't make for a great existence. And if you let that spiral, it can very quickly become depression. So I think that tragic optimism is again, it's a way to live in between these extremes, and to accept reality without spiraling. Another thing on Bruce Springsteen that's really interesting is, so there's a new singer-songwriter, and really kind of has become a pop star. His name is Zach Bryan. I think he's only 25 and a half, maybe 26 years old. And I think his music's very catchy, but it's not great. I don't know. Maybe I'm dating myself. He's just kind of like, he hasn't lived that much, whatever. But he's selling out arenas, millions of downloads on Spotify. And it'd be very easy to see someone like Bruce Springsteen be a curmudgeon and kind of say, I don't know about this guy. But Bruce Springsteen just did a collaboration with him. At age, how old is Springsteen now? 73, 74 maybe? And I think like that also embodies this kind of tragic optimism where you could sit there and complain about how the music industry, how everything's gone to streaming and how you have to look a certain way and be good on TikTok to be popular, right? Zach Bryan got started by posting all these 1-minute videos of him playing. And it'd be so easy to fall into just like being grumpy and shunning that. But instead, Springsteen goes and does a collab with him. And I think like that's really cool. And I'm much younger than 74. And I look to that, and I hope that when I'm 74, I have that kind of open heart and open mind that Bruce Springsteen has. Bill Walton recently passed away. Another what an example of someone that lived with tragic optimism. So these examples are out there, and they tend to be people that we all admire, yet it's very hard to go through life with that sort of attitude.
Another practice that you talk about that's very important that I want to break down a little bit is you talk about why it's so helpful to lean on routines and rituals to provide stability during times of disorder. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of routines when we're dealing with chaos? Because I write in my book, there's a chapter on habits of high performance. And one of the things that's very distinctive about the most successful investors is they're obsessed with their habits, their routines. And there's a point in the book where I quote a friend of mine, Ken Schubenstein, who was a very successful investor who then became a neurologist. And he talks about how basically the 4 habits he keeps coming back to in times of chaos are basically exercise, sleep, good nutrition, and meditation. Because it's like, those are the 4 that we know are great for cognitive health and cognitive function. You've thought very deeply about this whole area of routines and rituals. Talk us through this, how we should think about routines, what are the best routines that we should start to adopt, and also your philosophy of being quite dismissive of the movement towards optimization, which we're seeing with everyone from Huberman to Peter Attia, and you're going to be too polite to name names, so I'm naming them for you.
All right. This is a loaded question and a good question. So first off, I love your friend's 4 categories. The only one that I would consider adding, and my guess is he or she would agree with me, is the importance of community.
Yeah.
In making gathering with people that matter to you, whether that's your family, colleagues, friends, a cornerstone of your routines. All right, so square one, why are routines important? A little bit of neuroscience. Our brains are predictive. They are always trying to predict what's going to happen next. And for very good reason. There's so much stimulus in the world that if our brains couldn't think a step or two ahead, we would never make our way through the day. I mean, imagine if we're having this conversation and I'm predicting that you're going to listen and then respond. But if my brain couldn't do that, and my brain wasn't sure if you were going to hang up the call, if there was going to be an asteroid through the window, if you were going to say that the interview is going terrible, like it would never work. So even when we don't realize it, our brains are making predictions about what's going to happen next. And in times of change, in uncertainty and chaos, it becomes very hard to predict what's going to happen next. What a routine allows us to do is allows us to carve out this 1 or 2 or 3 areas of our life, however many components we have of our routine, where we can make a prediction. I'm going to go for a run in the morning. I'm going to make my afternoon coffee at 2. I'm going to sit down and pray or meditate or read or journal in the evening. That has a very high likelihood of coming true. And that is so satisfying for our brain at a neurochemical level to make a prediction and to have it come true. It's a part of our life that we have some control over. So that is the number one important value of a routine. Now, what that means is what the routines are don't matter as much as the fact that we have them, right? For you, it might be listening to AC/DC. For me, it might be meditating to the heart of the Buddha's teaching. Doesn't matter. As long as you have that thing and you do it at the same time, and your brain starts to associate that thing with a sense of control and predictability in your life, then good, it works. There are a few caveats, and I'm going to go very closely to what your friend that became the neurologist said. We do know, based on decades of science, that there are a few somewhat universal elements that can become routines that are helpful for just about everybody that tries or applies them. And first and foremost, exercise. Physical activity is the number one modifiable behavior for both physical health, mental health, and cognitive health. Number 2 would be community, some sort of social life, social gathering that's ritualized. Again, that can be a family dinner, that can be going to church or synagogue, that can be getting together with friends to play poker once a month. Doesn't matter what it is, but something that you can look forward to that happens on a regular interval that involves other people. Our species evolved in tribes. We're a very social species. That's what allowed us to survive predators like lions, is that a bunch of humans are smarter than one lion or a tribe of lions, or a pack of lions, I should say. So it's very much in our hardwiring during times of challenge to gravitate towards community. Sleep is really important. However, there's a lot of nonsense out there about sleep. So if you take these supplements, if you track your heart rate variability, there's some guy out there that's now tracking the strength of his during his sleep is a sign of his health. His name's Brian Johnson. I'm happy naming his name because I think he's out of insane. But a lot of people like him, and you can disagree. However, the research shows that the more that we worry about sleep, the harder it is to sleep. So if you turn sleep into something to excel at, then what is supposed to be the most restful, restorative part of your day, sleeping, now becomes something to win at or a metric to chase. Well, of course, it's going to be harder to sleep. So I think that sleep is the byproduct of a regular physical activity throughout your day, of making sure that you're not lonely, because we know that people who feel isolated and lonely, they don't sleep well. And then I would add nutrition is really important. But there's all these different diets, and it's really just about avoiding highly processed foods. I want to loop back because I know you have a very heady intellectual audience. People might say, what's Brad talking about? Social isolation and sleep, right? Because I didn't say like you need to take your magnesium to sleep better. I said, if you're feeling lonely, that could be driving poor sleep. And the reason for this is fascinating because again, we evolved in tribes. So early on in our species history, right when we're turning from these hairy primates that look closer to a gorilla or an ape to what we now view as a human, if you were alone, you can never fall asleep because you could be picked off by a mountain lion or by a predator, right? Literally, if you lost the tribe and fell asleep on the savannah, you're dead. You wouldn't survive long enough to pass on your DNA. But if you were in a tribe and you had strength in numbers, well, then you could rest and you could sleep because you knew that you weren't alone and isolated. And that still carries forth to today. The number one reason that social isolation is so detrimental to our health is because it raises our blood pressure and causes poor sleep. Isn't that fascinating? But it makes total sense because if you're alone, you're anxious and you always are on guard. You're always on the lookout so you don't sleep well. So for me, the big two are movement and community, and then I would put nutrition. And yeah, I think a lot of the other stuff around routine is very highly individualized. And I think anyone that tells you that there's this one supplement or this one breathing exercise or this one way to do something to have a routine that helps performance, I'd almost bet my bottom dollar that they're selling that one thing.
I wrote at length in my book about simplicity and the simplicity, really the sophistication that goes when you're basically you understand a topic so deeply that you can simplify and distill it down to its essence. I had done a lot of work as a ghostwriter and editor on a book about longevity and the like, which had been a #1 bestseller a few years ago. Not that I'm a paragon of good health or anything, but I've done a lot of reporting on this. And one of the things that really deeply resonated for me that I quoted in a footnote of my book was something where Dean Ornish, the father of lifestyle medicine, was talking to me about what he'd figured out from 40 years of research into everything that worked to reverse heart disease and diabetes and all of these things. And he said, really, I can sum it up in 8 words. And he said, eat well, move more, stress less, love more. And really,
I love that.
Yeah, it's an amazing sentence. And if you unpack each of those things, really it's eat well is more about, having more green stuff, more vegetables and the like. Move more, as you say, in a lot of your writing, you talk about just moving 30 to 45 minutes a day in any way that you'll do consistently. Doesn't really matter that much. Stress less, so anything from breathing techniques to meditation, and love more, which is the importance of community. And so I just thought that was a beautiful example of the reduction of this incredibly complex subject to something that was essential and true. And you've written a lot on your website and on your blog and talked about on your podcast about the bizarre things that people do to kind of sell us on great complexity. And it's complicated because our audience, these are high performers. I mean, we want to perform at the top level, but you point out, that all of these things like, Jocko Willink and Huberman sort of saying we should do this factory reset by, having hot saunas and then cold and then hot saunas again and cold and doing it again and again. Or, Huberman talking about getting lots of morning sunlight or selling AG1 and measuring our VO2 max, as Peter Attia would talk about, or wearing the Oura ring or the Whoop strap or a continuous glucose monitor or light blocking glasses or whatever. It's interesting and it's saleable. And I think if you're an incredible top performer, maybe some of this stuff is valuable, but I think it's so, I don't know. I bought a lot of these things while I was reporting that book, and I don't use any of them anymore. The only thing I think I continued to use was this really weird gadget that you strap onto your arm. What was it called? It's called an Apollo Neuro that vibrates. And it was developed, I think, at the University of Pittsburgh for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. For some reason, I find it unbelievably soothing. And when I lost it for several months, or it didn't work for several months, I remember finding it again and putting it on and I almost burst out crying. I was so happy that I had it back on. It was like finding an old friend again. So of all of those things that I used, I have masses of AG1 sitting in my fridge, untouched. I don't know, my Oura ring sitting beside the bed, unused. And I don't mean to insult anyone, but I think this gets at something really important. Do you have any thoughts about what I just said?
I do. So it's funny timing. I just had an op-ed published in the New York Times, the Sunday Times, on this very topic. And I'm going to quote from it. I say that over the last decade, I've studied excellence and I've worked with some of the world's best performers in the process. And this is true. I've worked with Ironman world champion, NBA, dynasty teams, really the best of the best when it comes to performance. And what makes a professional athlete or an Olympian great, it's not waking up at 5 a.m. to cold plunge and gaze at the sun. I mean, none of them do it. I've never worked with an elite performer that's worried about a morning cold plunge and low angle sunlight. Not one. But what they all have in common is a relentless focus on the fundamentals of their craft, executing those fundamentals with ruthless consistency for years, adopting the right mindsets, and surrounding themselves with the right people. And then having the right genetics is also really important. And that's it. So I think that actually when you look at the tippy top, no one is engaging in any of these kind of cockamamie health things because they don't have the time to do it. They're focused on nailing the fundamentals. And I think what happens is, I had a conversation about this with Morgan Housel, who I'm sure your audience knows of Psychology of Money and Same as Ever. And then I talked to my cousin, who I'm very close with, who I mentioned runs a very successful financial advisory practice. And I think that the trap that investors face is you don't have time to sit around and evaluate these claims, and you want to be on the cutting edge and you want to be a peak performer. But what I say to them is it's no different than all the cockamamie investment advice that goes around. And this stuff comes in cycles. And right now we're in a health and longevity cycle. 15 years from now, we might be back in a, cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme. Here's 10 ways to beat the market in 10 days if you buy my online course schedule. And because you have domain expertise, you can look at that and you can say, no. The way to become a great investor and to amass wealth is, I don't know because I'm not a great investor, but presumably there's a set of fundamental principles that are rather boring and you have to adhere to them for a very long time.
Yeah.
And the same is true.
Value a business and buy it for much less than it's worth. Joe Greenblatt had said to me, that's
right. So move your body every day, love more, and avoid ultra processed foods. That's it. But people don't want to hear that because it seems too simple. And I think that it's important to also note in this health and longevity space, and I've never met Andrew Huberman in person. I've never met Peter Attia, so I can't judge them personally.
And they're both brilliant. I don't mean to knock them.
Right.
They're gifted.
And they're very gifted communicators. And there is a kernel of truth to all of that. Like getting outside early in the day and getting natural light is undoubtedly helpful for one's circadian rhythm. No one would argue that. However, the notion of low angle morning sunlight, it has to be a certain angle and it has to be within 90 minutes of your waking up. That's extrapolated from 5 studies that looked at mice. Okay. There's no evidence that it makes a difference, especially if you're stressing about it and you're waking up earlier than you would in forfeiting sleep or if you're forfeiting exercise. Peter Attia and VO2 max. VO2 max, it's great to have a good VO2 max, of course. But how do you get a good VO2 max? There's no special program. You just move your body more. You exercise. So I think that what a lot of these communicators have done is they've latched on to these kind of complex scientific sounding terms that are proxies for very boring behaviors. And then people get very caught up in the science that sounds sexy and the bright and shiny objects and the new device. But at the end of the day, for health, again, it's regular exercise, avoid ultra-processed foods. The combination of those two things ought to result in a body weight that is not obese, because that's what we're talking about here. Having community, not using tobacco products. And then if you're going to drink, do so in moderation. And if you can't drink in moderation, then abstaining altogether. That's it. Like there's nothing else really matters. Now, if you want to be a great performer in a physical attribute, well, then you have to pick your sport and you have to train for that sport. No different than how you develop mastery or domain expertise in anything. And the last thing I'll say to loop back to something you said earlier, I couldn't agree more. The way that I like to think about mastery is you go from simple to complex back to simple. So when you're brand new to something, everything's simple. How do you deadlift 600 pounds? Well, you take all this weight and you lift the bar up off the ground. And then you get into complexity. There's switch grip versus overhand grip. There's pushing into the ground versus pulling. There's sumo versus conventional. There's pause deadlifts that you can do in your training. Do you need bigger quads or do you need stronger hip flexors? And on and on and on. And you can spend 6 years just reading about moving a bar from the ground to your hips. And then after the 6 years, how do you deadlift? You just pick the bar up. So it goes from simple to complex back to simple.
Yeah, it's very profound, this idea. And I write a lot about it in that chapter on simplicity and quote Josh Waitzkin. He talks about the mastery of very simple techniques, that usually it's not something very complex that accounts for success. It's the mastery of a very simple technique. So another thing, just to change subject, that's very important in terms of building this kind of rugged flexibility so that we can handle change and disorder well, is controlling our reaction to things. Because as we know from Stoic philosophy, we can't control what happens to us always, but we can control how we respond. One of the things that you talk about that's a very practical technique in Master of Change is what you call the 4 Ps technique. Can you explain how you use this technique in a way to become less reactive so that we're not controlled what happens? Because this really affects us as investors when the market's getting hit and we're likely to do something stupid, or when we're getting overexcited, or when we're in a fight with our kid or our spouse or whatever it is. And so I often think that these hinge moments in our day or our week or our life really kind of define whether we're going to be okay or not, how we handle these moments that could go either way.
So we are programmed as a species, it's our genetic inheritance to be very reactionary. And the reason for that is for over 99% of humankind, we didn't live in a modern world of computers and email. We didn't even live in civilized society, right? We lived on the savannah. And there were snakes at our feet and there were lions over the horizon. And if you see a snake or a lion, you do not want to be very thoughtful. You don't want to deliberately respond. You want to react, right? You want to get out of Dodge. Where I live in North Carolina, there's tons of snakes and bears. So I see big snakes and bears at least once a week when I'm out hiking. And even though I've seen them now 100 times, my blood pressure goes up and there's no thinking involved. I just jolt. And that's good. We're programmed to jolt because our survival depends on it in circumstances when we're dealing with snakes and bears. But when we're dealing with a stock market or a crying 6-year-old or a teenager or a spouse, generally speaking, jolting doesn't make sense. What ends up happening is we snap on someone or we make a poor decision and then we regret it later. So how do you shift from a reactive mode and how do you overcome millennia of evolution that primed us to react and get into a more responsive mode where there's more space, more thoughtfulness, you can be more deliberate? Many philosophers have said that our humanity lies in the space between stimulus and action. So something happens and what we do about it, the space between that, that's where our humanity lies. That's where our wisdom, our ability to make decisions lies. 4 Ps. First, pause and just do nothing. Take a couple deep breaths. Name the sensations that you're experiencing. Psychologists call this affect labeling. I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling restless. I'm feeling tightness in my brow. I'm feeling my fist clench. I'm feeling heat in my chest. I'm feeling a pit in my stomach. I'm feeling butterflies. I'm feeling excited. Name the emotion, name the actual physical sensation. What this does is by naming it, you no longer are it. So you put some space between yourself and the situation or yourself and the emotions that you're experiencing. And already you've diffused that reaction. Then you want to process what's actually happening here. What's going on? What does it mean for me? What pattern recognition can I draw on? What would happen if I wait until tomorrow to do something about this? What would happen if I do what my first instinct is? How might that play out a week from now, a month from now? How would I feel about that? Only then do you make a plan and say, given my resources, my capabilities, my skills, my patterns, given my values, here's how I think I want to move forward. And then you execute on that plan and you proceed. So you pause, you process, you plan, and then you proceed. And what that does is it creates space, right? Because the opposite is you panic and you pummel ahead.
Yeah, and if people want to learn more about this, I would definitely recommend that they go back and listen to my episodes with Daniel Goleman, the author of Emotional Intelligence, who also has thought a great deal about how to respond in these moments. And obviously meditation is huge in expanding that space between stimulus and response. It sort of puts things in slow motion a little bit.
And if I may interject real quick, because I think that I share this with Daniel, the goal isn't to not react, or I shouldn't say that. The goal isn't not to feel the reactionary sensations. The goal is just not to act on them. Like, I think it's very hard without taking massive amounts of sedatives to overcome that evolutionary hardwiring to feel reactivity. And I think if you judge yourself for feeling that way, you're always going to be judging yourself. What matters is that you don't act on it. So you can feel that reactivity and sit with it and let it calm down and then move forward. And I think this seems somewhat small, but it's very important, because often a lot of people say, well, I keep feeling reactionary. I must be doing something wrong. I'm not meditating enough. Or why am I so high stressed? And it's because, well, you're constantly in stressful situations. And it's okay to feel a stress response. Actually, if the stress response is shut down, then I'm worried. That's like chronic fatigue or a chronic stress state. You want to feel that initial jolt, and then you don't act on it, and you want it to come down really fast. So it's not about getting rid of that initial jolt. It's about not immediately letting it take over and tell you what to do.
Because you mentioned at the start of our conversation, you were totally blindsided a few years ago. I think this is back in 2017, by a period of depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. And you wrote in the book, it was a chaotic and bottomless spiral of pain and terror, really for about 8 months. And I wonder if you could talk a little about what you learned from that experience that also is really important in terms of developing an ability to deal with adversity, because you write in the book about self-compassion, surrender, acceptance, leaning on others and the like. Can you use that experience to talk about some of these other tools for building resilience, really in times where everything kind of goes to hell?
Sure. So the first thing is to recognize when you're in one of those times. And I'm sure I'm going to miss some examples, but the big ones that come to mind are severe physical illness, severe mental illness, and grief. Those are the big three. And when you're experiencing something like that, the worst thing that you can do is try to immediately grow or find meaning in the experience. It's like the other 99% of the time, practice gratitude, write down what you're grateful for, have a growth mindset, be really gritty, all those things. But the worst thing to do to someone that is in acute pain, be it physical or mental, or who has just lost a partner or a child, is to go to that person and say, well, what are 3 things you're grateful for? That would be the most tone deaf possible thing. And why? Because then you judge yourself, because you start to say, well, I don't feel grateful for anything. So now not only am I going through grief or depression or chronic pain, but I can't even do what all these self-help people tell me to do. I can't feel grateful, for something really must be broken and wrong. When the reality is, no, it sucks to go through grief and to have that kind of physical or psychological distress. And there are periods of life when things aren't meaningful. I mean, there's very little meaning to losing a child. It's an extreme example, but sometimes things just suck. And I think to be able to say that and to be able to name that, even if you're an uber optimistic, growth-oriented person, in all the other times of your life, there might be times of your life when things just suck, and that's okay. And the smartest thing to do, the real growth, is just letting things suck. There doesn't have to be any meaning associated with it. Sometimes things just suck. Now, what's fascinating is the research shows that often, not all the time, but often, you get to the other side of these experiences. And 1 year later, 5 years later, a decade later, you look back on them and maybe you've grown and maybe you've derived some meaning from them. But when you're in the thick of the challenge and the thick of the pain, just letting showing up and surviving be enough, like that's it. So sometimes things can just suck, and that's okay. What tools can help? Nothing is more important than community and leaning on others for support. Study after study of resilience shows that it's much less an inside game and much more an outside game. It's about being able to ask for help, to lean on a community for support, and then to take that help, to receive it. Voluntary simplicity, something that you've thought a lot about. When things in life feel chaotic and out of control, simplify wherever possible, right? If showing up and getting through is going to be a real challenge, make showing up and getting through as easy as you can. So instead of looking to add solutions, look to subtract things that are causing you additional distress. Surrender is really important. There are times when problem solving and fixing really work in our favor. But there are also times when problem solving and fixing get in the way because we are not in a position to fix something or to solve the problem. And it's so hard for driven type A people that have been hyper successful to eventually at some point let go and realize, I can't fix this. Maybe this thing is unfixable. And it's only when we surrender and when we do that, that we start to give ourselves a chance to get a little bit better because we stop getting in our own way.
I have about 1 million more questions for you, but I wanted to ask you one last thing, which is you have 2 kids, right? You have, I think, a 6 or 7-year-old Theo and a 1-year-old, I think, Lila, who's excellently named after a Robert Pirsig novel. When you think about all of the change and uncertainty and disorder they're liable to face as adults, whether it's climate change or political extremism or artificial intelligence, all the things that scare the hell out of us, what are you trying to model to prepare them? I mean, what can we do when we're trying actually to model the kind of qualities that our kids, the people around us, are going to need in order to deal with really what we know is going to be probably accelerating disorder and change rather than a return to some more peaceful era that we dream of?
I hope to model focusing on what we can control and trying not to waste energy worrying about what we can't. Tragic optimism and not being blind to all the tragedy, but also not letting all that tragedy turn into despair or nihilism. And then self-compassion and self-discipline. At an age-appropriate level, right now, for my 7-year-old, I think that's the most practical, which is you can do really hard things, and you should try to do really hard things, and you need to be kind to yourself. Because the only way it's going to be sustainable to keep showing up and doing hard things is if you don't beat yourself up when you fail. He had, earlier this year, his first strikeout in Little League Baseball, because it used to be T-ball, where you don't strike out. And he was devastated. He's a very competitive kid. He's crying. And I remember my gut reaction was to say, Theo, don't cry. But I didn't. What I said is, Theo, it sucks that you just struck out. And the reason that you're sad is because you care so much about hitting the ball and being a good teammate, and you try so hard and you really wanted to hit it. And sometimes even the things that we practice and we try really hard and we want, they don't go our way and you strike out. Sometimes it happens in baseball. It's going to happen in basketball. You're going to miss shots. It's going to happen with friends. And it's okay to feel sad and it's okay to cry right now. And you're going to get another shot and you're going to get another at bat. And you can go back in there and try again. And then, of course, like many parents, we talked about how the best hitters, they hit 300. They miss 7 times and they hit it 3. But really overriding that gut reaction to be like, don't cry, and replacing that with like, you care deeply and that's why this hurts and that's okay. And you don't have to beat yourself up. You can be sad, but you shouldn't feel guilty or ashamed because you're trying to do something really hard, which is hit a baseball. And I think that more than anything, that's what I want to teach Theo and Lila as she ages and it becomes appropriate in various contexts of their life.
Thank you so much, Brad. It's been a real treat chatting with you. And luckily we have so many things left over to talk about, though I'm going to have to talk to you again down the road. But thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, William.
Been a great pleasure. Nice to see you. Hi, folks. This is William Green, host of the Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast. Before you go, I wanted to share some news that I'm really excited about. Later this year, I'm going to launch a Richer, Wiser, Happier masterclass for a very small, intimate group of people who'd like to study with me over Zoom and also interact with me in person over the course of a year. This is going to be a totally unique experience because it's a tiny group of 10 to 20 people. We're going to meet once a month over Zoom to discuss the most important themes in my book, and I'll also talk about how my thinking on these subjects continues to evolve. Members of the masterclass group will also be invited to join me at a couple of very special events. One is a day in New York, which includes a private lunch and then a book launch party for the paperback edition of my book, which is due out in January. Then, during the weekend of Berkshire Hathaway's annual meeting, you'll join me at a private dinner in Omaha, where we'll discuss what we've learned from listening to Warren Buffett speak earlier that day. My goal in forming this masterclass group is to create a year-long journey of exploration for people who are deeply interested in building lives that are truly richer, wiser, and happier. If this appeals to you, please email Kyle Grieve, who's in charge of the waitlist. His email address is Kyle, that's Kyle, at theinvestorspodcast.com. And if the stars align, I'd really love to see you later this year when the masterclass begins. Thanks so much.
The only way to win the game is to stop playing. You have to play your own game. Don't try to play the game that professional investors play. And Graham instead is saying, tune out Mr. Market. Stop listening to people who tell you that because some sort of action is going on today, you have to participate. Instead, you should wait for opportunity to come along.